So today, we're starting at the beginning, going through the Bible again. So we did Adam and Eve a couple of weeks ago. Last week we kind of did our back to school lesson. So today we're looking at Abram, who was later renamed Abraham, as in, Father Abraham had many sons. That Father Abraham. So we kind of skipped over some of the early Bible stories when we went from Adam and Eve to Abram and Abraham. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of those stories are actually the ones you're really exposed to in children's church. Noah and the flood, Tower of Babel, and a lot of those are very early history, kind of biblical mythology. So we're skipping ahead to Abraham, who's kind of one of the first like firm characters who has a whole story arc, right? Noah has a couple of chapters. Abraham has a big chunk of Genesis, and it's kind of a detailed story that we won't be going into it in super detail, though, because there's a lot there, so we can't get into everything. So we're going to kind of just do some highlights of Abram. But before we get there, we kind of need to look at when is this, looking at the context of where we are. So you guys know that if we were in our actual Sunday school classroom, we have this huge poster board timeline that Trevor and I made, that goes across the top of the ceiling. Obviously, we don't have that here digitally. So I couldn't completely recreate it here in a slide, but I did my best. So I kind of wanted to talk about history, and the idea of history, because as we've talked about when we talked about the Bible, we think of history a very specific way as modern people, and it can be very hard for us to understand the way the world used to be, and as well as how people used to think of history. So first off, we think of history as a very clear timeline of facts that are 100%, these absolutely happened, right? Even though we as modern people even know that's not true, because we talk about biases, right? And we talk about how biases can affect the historical narrative. You see this when people say things like, the winner writes the history, right? So yeah, if you're writing a history from an American perspective of the American Revolution, of course you're going to cast the revolutionaries as heroes, right? Who were doing the right thing. But if you're the British, the Sons of Liberty were basically terrorists, terrorizing the population. And so you can have the same set of facts, looking at it from different ways. You can kind of cast people into different perspectives, right? And that's with modern stuff that we have a very good idea of what actually happened. The further in the past we get, the more squishy things are, and the less we know what actually happened. And the more that people's personal narratives affect what we think of as history. If you go back to the Roman Empire, a lot of what we think we know of what happened in the Roman Empire was written by people like Caesar. Julius Caesar had a very biased perspective of his own conquering, right? Did he really say, Winnie Weddy Weechi, I came, I saw, I conquered? And yes, it's Winnie Weddy Weechi. You pronounce the V's like W's in Latin. Or did he later, when he was writing about what he did, say, it would have been cool if I said that in that moment? I don't know. Could be either, right? So first off, just kind of perspective. We are this little green box up here. And this is not to scale. The map in the middle school classroom is about as to scale as I can make it. Trevor and I spent a lot of time measuring, trying to make things as to scale as we could. The PowerPoint's harder. So we live now in what we call the information age, essentially the age of the internet. Anything you want to know is basically at your fingertips. It's kind of the computer age, right? Before us, was the space age. That would be kind of the Cold War time period. Before that, you kind of have, gosh, I always kind of think of things of like literary things. You have like diesel punk, right? You have cars and stuff like, I mean, we have cars now, but you know what I mean? Like that was like cutting edge of technology, like World War One, World War Two. Before that, you have the Victorian era. That's when Queen Victoria ruled England. And before that, you're really getting back into the Industrial Revolution. And the American Revolution kind of started when the Industrial Revolution is. So the Industrial Revolution is this kind of gray box here. The Industrial Revolution changed the world. It changed everything, right? The Industrial Revolution lets you make clothes by machine. The Industrial Revolution is when you saw this huge migration of people into living into cities. I mean, we take that for granted now, right? We don't all live on farms. But the Industrial Revolution is really when that started happening because the manufacturing jobs were in the cities. So before that, this yellow box, that's kind of the Protestant Reformation, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, right? I probably should have started the yellow box earlier. My bad. Let's see if I'll fix that live for you. Fixing it because there's kind of an overlap between the Middle Ages and this time period because the Renaissance started earlier in Italy, right? So it started in like the 1300s in Italy, but Northern Europe was kind of still in the Middle Ages. So most of our modern thought patterns come from this time period. And if you're looking at this map, that's not that long ago, right? The way we think as people is influenced by this yellow time period heavily. That's, the Enlightenment, you kind of get Descartes. That's, I think, therefore I am, right? Kind of this thinking about philosophy, logic, science, that the need for things to have concrete proofs and things like that. Before that yellow box, people didn't have proof for anything, and they didn't think it was necessary. Like you might fall sick and they'd be like, well, you just walked through a bad humor. What does that even mean, you guys? It's just kind of like you could have walked through a cloud and they're like, and now you're sick. Sorry. They didn't know about germs. They just didn't have the logic, which isn't to say people weren't logical or reasonable back then, but the logic practices that we use today are informed by this yellow time period, by the Enlightenment, the Protestant Reformation, and the Renaissance. Especially us as Protestants, we're heavily influenced by the Protestant Reformation. And the Protestant Reformation was a huge step away from mysticism, which, modern Protestants, we don't like the idea of the supernatural, right? We don't like the idea of demons. We don't like the idea of ghosts. We don't like the idea of spirits. And when I say we don't like the idea, we kind of think like these aren't real, right? Which is why when we talk about things like Jesus getting rid of the demons from the girl in the New Testament, or always like people will be like, well, it could have been just she was mentally ill, right? That's a very modern way of looking at it. And it could be she was just mentally ill, or it could be demons. I don't know. But in the ancient time periods, mental illness was not something they knew about. And everything was demons' fault, right? Everything. Things that today we know are definitely not demons. They were like, that's demons. Totally demons. Because they had no explanation for why things were happening. So they were like, it must be God, right? Or the supernatural or something like that. Whereas today we're like, you got sick because someone coughed on you, right? Hannah says, that's why I hate Halloween from when I found out the real meaning. Real meaning of anything, I always find highly questionable. Halloween is my favorite holiday because in modern America, Halloween is a holiday of imagination and candy. And those are two things I love. But because meanings change and they're allowed to change, right? But, it's everybody's prerogative. Even Christmas has changed. Easter has changed. So as we step further back into history, you get to the Middle Ages, which, that's when you think about knights and kings and things like that. It's also called the Dark Ages. And you have the Crusades. this is a very European centric map. I should obviously say that, because my perspective is very European Western centric. If we did this from a China centric perspective, it would kind of look different. The Middle Ages were not the same there. They were in very different time periods. But during that time period, people were very like, if God loves you, you'll be wealthy and blessed, and you'll be a king, divine rights of kings, and very, very. I mean, just watch any medieval times movie. Most of them are wrong historically, but you get an idea of what kind of was like. People didn't think the same way we did. They thought very mystically. That's why they're always burning witches, right? Like, it wasn't enough to just be like, well, this woman just thinks differently from me. They were like, no, let's burn her at the stake because she thinks differently from me. So before that, we really get into time periods that are named after kind of the predominant tool method we have, like the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, the things they could make things out of. And most of us, when we think of ancient history, Iron Age is about as far as we go back to in our mind. We think Roman Empire, we think the Greeks, right? Like, what's the oldest thing you can think of in your mind? It's probably Egypt, which is fair. But during the Iron Age, the time that we think of as like the Greeks and the Romans, historically, that is not that long ago. It's fairly recent, right? And the Trojan War is probably, the Trojan War is a great example of history and myth and like not understanding things, right? So most of what we know, all of what we know about the Trojan War is from Homer's The Iliad, which is an epic poem. And for the longest time, people thought the Trojan War was made up. They thought Troy wasn't a real place. They thought that Homer just made up this whole story, and they were like, that's cool. Stories are cool. We're not going to begrudge Homer that, right? But then like 100 years ago, they found the city of Troy, and they were like, holy crap, this is real. Like, there was a Troy, and it was clearly like burned down and rebuilt multiple times. So there were clearly wars. So we have, whether there was an Achilles and things like that, no idea. That's probably all made up by Homer for literary effect. But there probably was a real war between Greece and Troy. And before that really is Egypt. Now, as you see, Egypt is a huge time period here. I put King Tut ruled Egypt right here. This is right before the Trojan War. But the pyramids were built way before that, you guys. And the pyramids aren't even early Egypt. Egypt was this huge empire for longer than most of us can imagine. Most modern countries, like the oldest government that still is in work, Trevor would probably know better. I mean, technically the British have been ruled by a pretty seamless line of kings since 1066, though their government has changed really drastically during that time period. They have adapted and changed themselves, but they probably wouldn't have called themselves a new government. The French have renamed themselves like 5 times at this point. They're on like their 5th French government. Germany is on a completely new government from, East and West Germany. Countries don't really last that long, like governments. And empires and things like that. Most of the countries we think of haven't been around that long. But Egypt was around for thousands of years. Trevor says that the Papal State may be the oldest. That's fair. So when we talk about Abraham is not a person like us. Abraham's from this time period. And I put Abrahamish here because it's really squishy. It's hard to say when exactly Abraham is. It's hard to say when exactly anything is back here. Anything, especially before the founding of Rome, you should add like plus or minus 100 years, if not 200 years to the date we think it is, because we really don't know. The founding of Rome, the only reason why we're like, it is definitely 753 BC, is because the Romans were pretty adamant it was 753 BC. Now, they could be misunderstanding, but that was the date their calendar actually starts on. So all their years count from 753 BC. So it's really hard to say when anything is exactly back here. And anything written during this time period is going to be more about the story it's telling and less about facts that these things actually happened. Because once again, people were less concerned about this actually happened. They are more concerned about what are we saying about ourselves? What are we saying about this person? And what is the meaning and the purpose? All right. So with that, let's actually get into Abraham, who is this ancient Bronze Age guy who lives in a completely different world than we do. He can't even imagine anything we have today. This is a guy who lives in ancient Mesopotamia where they're writing with cuneiform on tablets. Okay. All right. So open your Bible to Genesis 12. Genesis 12, 1 through 9. So now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and one who curses you I will curse. And in all of the families of the earth shall be blessed, and in you all families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abraham took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot, and all the possessions they had gathered, and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At the time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give you this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent. And Bethel was on the west, and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord. And Abraham journeyed on the stages towards the Negeb. All right, so there's a lot here. First, backing up. Where does Abram live now? God has clearly told him to go somewhere here. So where does Abram live? Abram lives in this place here called Ur. It also references Haran, but Haran is also the name of Abram's brother. So that's probably his brother's land. So Ur is in this. So this map is actually 14th century. So Abram's older than that, but this is the only non-copyrighted free use map I could find. So please forgive me. So he lives in Ur, and God has asked him to move to Canaan, which is over here. Now today, if I said, "Mike, I need you to move to Maryland," you'd be like, "Oh, that sucks." But oh, whatever, not a big deal, right? Rent a U-Haul, pack your stuff up, drive to Maryland. Well, maybe I'm going to ask you to move to another country if I'm God. Maybe I'll be like, "Hey, Mike, can you move to India?" Right? And you might be like, "Wow, India's weird compared to my, where I'm from. I don't know if I'm going to understand everything." But you know what? It's the modern world. We have the internet everywhere. So I can still talk to my family. I can still, send emails. I can still send regular mail. In fact, I can still order from Amazon in India. And you know what? People in India, a lot of them speak English. So that's not even that bad. Right? And, Bollywood, that's pretty cool. So India, well, I could move there, right? Abram, it's not like this during his time period. He's basically being asked to move to Mars by God, right? He has no idea what Canaan is like, where it is, who lives there. Are there aliens? I don't know, right? There are no aliens on Mars. But, he's going through a frontier that from his perspective no one's ever been to, and it's not like he can just email his brother and be like, "Hey, Haran, having a good time in Mars." No. Once you leave your family group, you're pretty much never going to see them again and never talk to them again. This is a huge commitment. He's not just moving, to Uruk over here and, maybe they can still get together occasionally. No. He's moving to Canaan. The other thing is you wouldn't cross this way. So you're like, "Oh, that's not too far, point to point," right? But this is all deserty. This is the Mesopotamia area, right? So when Abram went to Canaan, he went like this. So when we look back at the verses, it's like God said, go to Canaan. He went to Canaan and he made it there. Boom. 2 verses were in Canaan, right? Super quick journey, right? Right? No. Super long journey. This would take a really long time. So he's originally from Ur. He probably ended up, this is Haran, right? So he probably ended up over here somewhere. And then he moved down to here. Regardless, once you're gone, you're gone. You're never seeing those people ever again. This is huge. It's God telling you to move to Mars. Actually, it might even be worse than that, because with today's technology, you've seen The Martian. We can talk to you on Mars. It's more like God asked you to move to Alpha Centauri, which is 4 light years away, right? We're never talking to you again. You've been asked to go at relativistic speeds and leave. And when you come back, we're all going to be dead if you come back. So it's a big commitment. And for Abram to just be like, sure, God, I'll do that. That actually shows a huge amount of faith on Abram's part. So the other thing I want to talk about is there's a couple of names mentioned in here. So we have Abram, we have his wife, and we have his brother's son, Lot. So family tree. Abram's dad was Terah. He had 3 sons that we know of: Haran, Nahor, and Abraham. Haran's son was Lot. For Mike says Mars ain't the kind of place to raise your kids. In fact, it's cold as heck. Yeah, I wouldn't. It seems unhostile. I mean, it seems inhospitable. Very hostile. So Lot is Abram's nephew. For Lot to go with Abram, that probably means Haran's dead. And that Abraham's kind of like the family patriarch. Though we know that Nahor's family stays in Haran because, as we'll see later, Rebecca is descended from this line. So Lot was like, I don't want to stay here by myself. I'll go with Abraham. And basically Abraham kind of adopted Lot, not in a, what's the word I'm looking for? Not in a sense that Lot was going to get everything Abraham had when Abraham died. Like Lot wasn't the person who's going to inherit from Abraham. But Abraham looked after him and took care of him and took him. And so that shows Lot has a lot of faith in Abraham. So Abraham had a lot of faith in God to move out to here. And Lot would have had to have a lot of faith in Abraham to say, I'm going to go with you. The other thing that I think is important to pull out of here is that while Abraham is kind of a random dude, he is a random, very wealthy dude. As you can see in here, he has a lot of possessions. He has a lot of persons. Like he owns lots of slaves, you guys. He is a man with wealth. And his wealth is in his property, right? And I don't mean like land. And money wouldn't have had the same meaning back then, right? Because you're moving to Canaan, right? Food is money. Abraham had a lot of animals and humans. He had a lot of stuff. And stuff was what made you wealthy, especially things like animals and humans. He owned animals and humans, and those things can go a long way, right? Humans give you labor. Animals give you food, clothing, all sorts of things. From goats, you're getting milk. You're getting, their wool. You get lots of stuff. So Abraham was a very wealthy man. And when God told Abraham he was going to Canaan, Abraham took everything he owned and everyone he owned. So yeah, he basically pulled those slaves out with him, which is questionable, but all right. So next, Genesis 15, 1-7. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. No one but your own issue shall be your heir. He brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them. Then he said to him, So shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. And then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. So Abraham went through a lot of stuff. If you read his story, there was this whole he ended up in Egypt. He lied about Sarah being his wife. He ended up in the middle of this war in Canaan. It was very awkward for everybody involved. A lot of weird things going on. And so at times Abram, was afraid and uncertain. And God's like, don't be afraid. I've got your back and you're going to get a great reward. And Abram's like, ungrateful. He's like, God, what is the point of a reward? I mean, I'm going to die and it's just going to go to some slave I own. What's the point, God? And he's basically complaining because he has no kids. Now, we've talked about before, having no kids back then is not like having no kids now. If you have no kids now, like me and Trevor, right? You're still living a good life. We have a nice house. We go on lots of trips because we can save money. And there's no crying toddler in this house right now, which is great. But back then, who's going to take care of you when you're old? Now, there's lots of ways to do that, right? You can set things up so you're taken care of when you're old. We have a whole infrastructure to take care of people who can't take care of themselves. But Abraham would have worried about that. He also would have worried about his legacy. Who is taking on the family name, but also who is taking care of Sarah after he dies. You need a son to do that. So people were very obsessed with reproducing and having heirs. So ungrateful Abraham is like, I don't care what you've done for me, God. I need a son. And God's like, chill, Abraham, chill. You're gonna get a son. It's gonna be fine. You're gonna have as many descendants as there are stars in the sky. And Abraham's like, right, God, sure. I'm pretty old. My wife's pretty old. Whatever. But God calms him down and he's like, I promise you, your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. I brought you from Ur to here. Trust me on this. And so Abraham's like, okay, I guess, God, I guess I'll trust you for now, which we'll get into next week. So next, Genesis 17, 1-8. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, and I will make my covenant between me and you, and will make you exceedingly numerous. Then Abraham fell on his face, and God said to him, As for me, this is my covenant to you. You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the ancestor of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and your offspring after you throughout their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land where you are now an alien, all the land of Canaan, for a perpetual holding, and I will be their God. So, you guys may have heard of the idea of the old covenant, which is that we live in the new covenant, which is Jesus. But if there's a new covenant, that means there's an old covenant. This is that old covenant going all the way back to 2000-ish, 1500-ish BC. God and Abram were made this agreement. So what is a covenant? A covenant is essentially a contract. It's a churchy word for a contract. We say marriages are a covenant. Marriages in societally are a contract, right? You literally sign a marriage contract. But in the churchy word, we use covenant because covenant kind of is just like a contract that involves God. So this is a contract between God and Abraham. What is it? God says, I will be the God of your descendants. We've talked about before that these are people who, they believed all the gods were real. But ultimately they chose our God, the God, as their God, right? And it's because of this covenant. God said, I will look out for your ancestors. I will make sure you have a lot of ancestors. descendants. Sorry. I will look out for your descendants. I'll make sure you have a lot of descendants, and I will always be there for them. That is my promise to you, Abraham. And in return, God only asked one thing of Abraham, because this is before the law. We're going to get to the law later, and when we think of Judaism, often we think of the law, we think of all these rules. But God didn't give Abraham the law. God gave Abraham one rule, which was circumcision, which is that all the men had to be circumcised. So pretty easy thing to do. I mean, it's like a medical procedure, and I don't trust medical procedures in 2000 BC. That's very sketchy. So that actually shows a lot of faith in God, because you're talking about a time period where if you cut yourself shaving, you could die of tetanus, you guys. So surgery, no matter how minor, is a pretty questionable thing back then. So to do something that is like circumcision, which is a minor surgery, in this ancient time period, actually does show that you are putting your faith and your trust in God, that he's going to see you through this okay. The reason Abraham's story is important is because it's the foundation for everything to come in the Old Testament. Everyone in the Old Testament looks back and says, when Moses asks God who he is, he says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, right here, right? This is where the covenant between God and the Jewish people, where the Jewish people becoming God's chosen people, this is where this starts. God chose Abraham. And from Abraham comes the Hebrews, right? We'll also talk that's not the only people group to come from Abraham. And there's, a whole set of Abrahamic religions. But this is the start of everything. But it's not the end of Abraham's story. And we're going to see Abraham, just looking at this, we're like, oh yeah, Abraham's super faithful, man. He moves across the country, or the world. He moves across the known world for God. He trusts God that he's going to have a kid. The circumcision thing's pretty trusting in God. Abraham's very faithful. For now. We'll see next week that Abraham doesn't always trust God like he should. That sometimes he thinks that he needs to take actions into his own hands rather than wait on God's timing, which I think is something we can all relate to. Sometimes we just want what we want now, and we don't want to wait for God to provide us what he said he would. So Abraham is not a perfect man by any means, but he was a man of faith. And he was a man who trusted God and followed God across the world. And there's a lot to be learned from that. But next week, we will continue Abraham's story with Sarah. And we'll look at a little more from Sarah's perspective and kind of talk about this promise of a son and the outcome of that. So that is today's lesson.